Welcome back to my channel, everyone. Today, as you can see, we're going to be talking about Margaret Atwood's novel, The Handmaid's Tale, and more specifically focusing on the political significance of women's rights. Because, of course, this novel at its heart is a novel about stripping away women's rights and forcing them to have children for other people. Um, so in this video, I'm not going to be talking so much about the novel specifically itself, but certainly talking about some of the important historical context which forms the backbone of what we end up reading when we pick the book up to study or to read. The aim of this video is to give you, therefore, the historical background, and it's mainly aimed at A-level students. But I don't see why this video wouldn't help those of you who are interested in the novel or even the TV series more broadly. So this is the second video that I have uploaded about The Handmaid's Tale. The first was about a year ago, and it was about a generic video about just some revision points, really, aimed again at A-level students studying political and social protest writing. And I finished that video with a similar flowchart to this because I always think it's interesting to start to think about what is meant by a utopia, and this idea of what often a society becomes is a result of the ideology of the political leader at the time. So, what happens to women in this novel is the result of someone having a political vision, or a party, for example, that all share in the same vision. So, I think it's interesting to ask students, what is your idea of an ideal society? What is your vision? What laws would you need in order to make that vision a reality? And would your laws be fair? Would they be fair for all citizens? Or are the laws you are creating naturally going to discriminate against some people? So the key question on this flowchart is, how are you going to achieve this vision? How are you going to make sure that your vision becomes a reality? How is this utopia that you have in mind for your fellow citizens actually going to be brought about? Because if nothing happens, it will remain an aspiration rather than a reality. So this is when you get a so-called fork in the road. You either attempt to get the public on side with you and convince them that what you have in mind is the right path to take for your country or society at the time. And the question then is, well, what are you going to use to do that? Are you going to fearmonger? Are you going to suggest there's a scary alternative if you don't vote this way? Are you even going to turn to religion and theocracy to legitimize what your vision is? Alternatively, if you're not going to get people, if you're not going to convince people through what you say, the question then is, well, are you going to be prepared to use force? And of course, there have been lots of regimes over the years across the world that have used force to get people to comply. And if you are going to start using force, and if you're going to start becoming quite punitive, and you're going to create rules, then you've got to create a system of punishment, because what's the punishment if they don't comply? What's the consequence? And therefore, the question becomes, who is going to suffer? So we know in The Handmaid's Tale, for example, the women suffer by being sent to the colonies and to kind of rake radioactive waste. Allegedly, that is what is said, even though we don't see it necessarily. So if you're going to use force, you're going to have to create a system of punishment for those that don't comply. And that leads me to what I've already said, which is that, in my view, and I think it's true, that creating a utopia for all citizens is very difficult, if not impossible. In other words, you're never going to be able to keep everyone happy all of the time. Let me give you an example. Let me give you an example of the government saying that the rich have to pay more tax. If you're rich, that's a bit of a dystopia for you because you're going to have to pay more tax. So it's always going to be a balancing act between trying to please lots of different people at the same time. And I think that it's naive to think that that's going to happen, because by its very nature, government is going to pass legislation that is going to penalise in some way or another a certain group of people based on something. So in answer to the question, I think it's impossible to create utopia for all. In creating a utopia, you're going to create a dystopia for others. So it's always going to be this balancing act. So that's an interesting way to begin, I think, looking at this novel. And this idea that, in my view, the ego of politicians is inseparable from their political vision because they believe with all of their being that they are the person to bring about this positive change. It's inseparable. And of course, that often doesn't happen. They often fall on their sword. But I believe you have to be pretty confident in your own abilities to be a president or a prime minister, to believe that your vision is the right way to go. And that takes some ego as well, I think. So, to give you a timeline then of the end of the 20th century, and of course there is lots in this novel that happens before the late 20th century. But let's just talk about the 1960s onwards. So in the 1960s and 70s, you not only had the free love hippie movement and the liberalisation of laws, but you also had second wave feminism, of which Margaret Atwood was aware, and of course writing at the time. So I'm talking about second wave feminism a bit later. Then in the 80s, 1981, Margaret Atwood started writing the novel, and it was published in 84/85, depending on where you are in the world. And in the 1980s, we also had the election and, the President Ronald Reagan being elected in, Republican president, who went about making this reputation for himself as being a bit of a strongman. We've heard that before. And also using quite inflammatory rhetoric, such as calling the Soviet Union the evil empire, for example. So using quite inflammatory language, even in the most powerful position in the world. I'll talk more about Ronald Reagan in a second. And then in 2016, if we go straight to kind of the 21st century now, of course, post 9/11 world, you had the election of Donald Trump in 2016. And of course, now we're having the election of Donald Trump in 2024 as well for his second term. Both Donald Trump and Ronald Reagan were elected in part because they were regarded as strongmen, America First rhetoric, quite a nationalist agenda. And by late 2016, when Donald Trump won the election in November of that year, Hulu and the TV networks were already filming the first series of what became a very successful adaptation of The Handmaid's Tale, starring Elizabeth Moss. And Margaret Atwood has said herself many times that because of that election, even though the novel hadn't changed and the script hadn't changed, the frame of the story had changed because people went from saying this novel is a bit of a kind of an empty threat of what a future could be to actually going, here it comes. So the frame of the story changed. So this novel actually has its origins much earlier than when it was actually published in the mid-80s. America as a country is always split between two extremes. It's either going to be a democracy based on equal rights, or a word egalitarian, or it's going to be seen as a fundamentalist theocracy. It actually began as a fundamentalist theocracy through Puritanism in the 17th century. That's where its heart is. And it's flipped between these two varying forms of society or government throughout the centuries. And some critics might say right now, with the second term of Donald Trump, that we're moving back towards the theocracy side, towards what America was in the 17th century, which was much more based on Puritanism. So when Americans go to the polls and you have red and blue, it's kind of a very binary system, unlike other countries. This tends to be what you're voting for a lot of the time, broadly speaking, of course. So if we talk about religious theocracy and America, as I've already said, the United States began as a Puritan theocracy in the 17th century. And whenever you have a country that begins life in this way, there is always the potential for this form of living to come back. And through the two elections now of Donald Trump, it's arguable that you could say we're currently living through one of these moments where this kind of Puritanism is now more tempting than another form of kind of democracy. Um, Reagan's presidency in the 1980s also energized the religious right, and the Christian fundamentalists at the time decided to go political. They decided that a religion was not just suitable for a personal belief system, maybe a comforting personal belief system, but the religious right started to use God and religious belief and even religious doctrine or religious passages in the Bible to justify why certain presidents or certain laws governmentally should be enacted. And of course, we've seen that even in recent times with how Donald Trump has stirred and created this very religious Christian base um, in order to win votes. It has been a successful marketing tool for him. And we have seen, even in recent news footage during the election campaign of 2024, for example, the amount of support that Trump has from so-called religious people who believe that it's God's will that he is president. They believe that God wants him as president, and that might be something that God wants forever. So they never want another election because God and Trump are kind of almost like the same thing. Of course, in the UK, we have a much bigger divide between religion and government. The UK is far more secular in this way, and you will rarely hear, if ever, politicians in the UK use any kind of religious thinking as a way to gain votes. There's a much bigger gap between um, religion and politics in the UK. I think the UK is probably more secular as well. Um, so America is always going to be tempted, I suppose, with this lurch back to what it was in the 17th century, which is a Puritan theocracy. And certainly theocratic thinking is what we see in The Handmaid's Tale. So there's always going to be a conflict between these two things. And just to give you an insight, we often hear from people that they want society to be progressive. They want society to move forward. Um, that is not always guaranteed, of course. We don't actually know what the future may bring. We don't, again, what does progressive mean here? Move forward to what? These are kind of broad terms which actually need much more debate because they're quite subjective and open-ended. But as well as people that want to be progressive, whatever that means, some people also want to return to how things were. And the reason they want to return to how things were was because it was safer. They might have nostalgia, for example. So whereas some voters will want to go forward and give people perhaps more rights, some people will inevitably want to go back. Some people want to go back, for example, to the 1950s. Some might want to go back to the 1850s. And of course, whenever you go back, there comes the regression and repeal of certain rights, such as the rights of women. So, shock horror, the amount of rights women had in 1951 was nowhere near the same amount of rights that women have now. So a lot of the time, fear is a big motivator in terms of who you vote for. If the future looks scary, you're going to go back. I think a quote from the novel is better never means better for everyone. That's what I've already said. Utopia isn't always a utopia. And what does better mean? Again, better, like progressive, is a subjective term. It needs much more debate about what better actually is. So a quote that I've heard Margaret Atwood give before in interviews is there is not just one future, but many possible futures. And the type of future we get depends on who we vote for now. There is no guarantee that there's going to be peace in the future. There's no guarantee that the way we live now will be the way that we're living in 10 years' time, unfortunately, because the future is a vast place with lots of unpredictability in it. Who knew, for example, in 2019, what 2020 would bring with the pandemic? So you never know what's coming. And that's why when we're voting, we have to be very careful for who we're voting for and to make sure that we can trust them in terms of their vision. Um, In the novel, of course, birthrights and the rights of women over their bodies is a key factor. And language, and you might expect me to say this as an English teacher, but language is a powerful thing. It shapes perspectives and perspectives on things. So we often hear pro-choice and pro-life regarding people's views on abortion. But let's change the language. Why don't we call pro-choice against forced childbirth and called pro-life forced childbirth? It might sound more graphic and more disturbing, but that's what it is, isn't it? You know, pro-life sounds better, but isn't it also forced childbirth? Aren't you forcing women to have children they don't want? So it's interesting as well to play about with language, and language can often force us to see things from a certain perspective. So Margaret Atwood herself has made this distinction. Abortion, you know, our approaches to abortion changes perhaps when we change the labeling of such a thing. So going back to kind of some central questions that this novel asks us to consider, really, and again, it's interesting to have these discussions with students. Who actually has control of a woman's body? Does the state own you? Is your private life truly private? We see in The Handmaid's Tale that family private life uh, actually becomes something that is politicized through the removal of children, removal of names, removal of partners, removal of jobs, etc. So, do we actually have a private life, or is it an illusion? Um, are certain laws needed for the survival of the country? I say that because, of course, one of the reasons why the Gilead has the childbearing law is because of the falling birth rate, which is something that a lot of countries around the world right now in 2025 are having to deal with. The question is, if you have a falling birth rate, what do you do to make sure your country doesn't effectively die out, I suppose? And finally, and this is why we have pictures of butterflies here, if you give women new rights, so for example, rights that have come from campaigns in the Second World Feminism wave, um, how do you take those rights away? And once you have given women the taste of more rights than they had before, again, what do you do if they do not comply? So, in other words, if the butterflies are flying around the room freely, how are you going to get them all back into the box again easily? If you have given women credit cards and have allowed them to get mortgages without their husband's consent, how are you going to convince them that going back to needing that consent or not having credit cards is the right thing? So when you give people a taste of freedom, it's often harder to take it away from them again, particularly if it's something they like. So just some central questions really that might create interesting debate and discussion in the classroom. As you may know, if you're studying this novel or have researched this novel, you will know that Atwood has been very clear and has said that nothing in this novel is made up. Everything has a precedent in this novel. And I just want to give you 6 examples of how a woman's reproductive rights have always been on some kind of political agenda, giving you different examples really from different parts of the world. Um, so the first thing is, of course, the repeal in June 2022 of Roe versus Wade, um, which in 1972 legalized abortion. It seems that even in 21st century America, which is supposed to be a beacon of freedom and democracy, that laws are being repealed, which takes women's rights away and removes the control that they have over their bodies. Another example is that in slave populations, slaves were often forced to have children so there would be more slaves. So that is another example of where a tyrannical force is making rules for an inferior group in order to benefit them later on. So, a slave owner, their utopian vision would be to have a constant stream of slaves, so they would never run out, for example. That's going to be a dystopia for the slaves themselves, of course. Another example, in the French Revolution, well, around the French Revolution, Napoleon made abortion illegal because he wanted what he called more cannon fodder, more soldiers. So even in France, there has been a history of abortion being used politically to control women. In Denmark, well, in Greenland, Denmark fitted indigenous Greenlanders with contraceptive coils to reduce, if not eradicate, the Greenland population. That was on TV I watched recently. So even other European nations um, fitted their, uh, fitted women with devices which effectively controlled the amount of children they can have, probably because of underlying racism there. Nicolae Ceausescu in the 1960s in Romania, in his Decree 770, limited access to contraception and restricted abortion. I think he made it law that most women had to have 4 children, and that, of course, resulted in a huge increase in orphanages, in children being abandoned, and also women dying in childbirth. So this again was because the Romanian birth rate was falling, and he was panicking that the Romanian blood would peter out. So that was his solution. And finally, the Nazis stole blonde children from their parents in Poland to place with German parents to boost the agrarian population, the blonde-eyed, blue-eyed, blonde-haired population. So in just 6 examples here, we can see that um, women's reproductive rights have always been a political football. They have always been on the agenda for a certain type of political party. And the story, of course, is not going to end there because it rarely ends. History kind of continues, it never ends. So we await to see around the world more examples of where women are being used in terms of their reproductive rights as a political football. Something to control, of course. So, as I've already said, in The Handmaid's Tale, everything in the novel has already happened at one point in history somewhere in the world. So nothing has been invented. Everything already has a precedent. And that's perhaps what makes the novel powerful. It also stops the novel being called science fiction because Atwood makes the distinction between science fiction and speculative fiction. She calls The Handmaid's Tale an example of speculative fiction because it is a possible future. It could happen. And that's why the novel is often called prophetic, because it seems to have predicted America's move back into this kind of religious right, totalitarianism, as has actually happened now in the 21st century, around 40 years after its publication. So, of course, pre-internet age, Atwood couldn't go on Wikipedia to do all this. She used books and newspapers, and she had clippings, and she kind of stitched them together in a tapestry of real events that humans have done over the centuries in order to prove, I suppose, just how awful humans can be to one another at a particular time. So we might call this in literature social realism. It's not make-believe, it's real, it's happened, and it might happen again, who's to say? So just to talk about the American Constitution, which is interesting in this case, Christian fundamentalists proclaim that as soon as an egg is fertilized, it has a soul. And a soul, of course, is a theological construct which may or may not exist. It depends on your own personal views. You cannot prove a soul doesn't exist, but you also cannot prove that it does. However, the US Constitution, the First Amendment, states that you cannot force people to follow a religion that they don't want to follow. So, in other words, you give people religious freedom, and also the freedom to be atheist or agnostic as well if they want to be. So there's a hypocrisy here, because if you are repealing Roe versus Wade and effectively forcing women to have children, effectively what you're doing is you're assuming that they're going to go along with the belief that they follow that particular religion. So even if a woman believes that a fertilized egg does not have a soul, they are still being forced to go along with this belief, even if they are not even if they are not religious, or even if they do not believe in a soul. So the Constitution itself is hypocritical because it's suggesting that women have to go along with this theological position, which is that an egg has a soul. Um, so there's a complexity there in terms of the American Constitution, which of course only America can resolve. It's not for me to tell them; it's for them to resolve. But there is this hypocrisy in the First Amendment. So fear, as I've already said, is quite a key political motivator. Ceausescu, for example, feared the decline of the Romanian population. Many fear the rise of secularism. And there have been many world events which have made people fearful. 9/11, for example. And what they do is they hark back to a safer time, which might be rooted in nostalgia. However, you don't necessarily want all of the laws that were around then, because they might have not been as equal. So you will always get political leaders that promise they will make them feel safer, and they present a utopian vision, i.e. vote for me, I'll make it better for you. But again, what does that mean? So does making society better mean giving people more freedom and the retraction of political surveillance? In other words, more freedom. Or does it mean using force and more rules and the threat of sanction to get what you want people to do? In other words, how do you get people to comply? So what does, how do you make society better? Do you give people more choice, or do you give them less choice? If you choose the latter, so if you go down the route of using force, is idealism long lasting? So, or is it short? So the French Revolution, for example, started as a utopian vision, which quickly descended into chaos. If you do Blake's poetry, you might touch upon the French Revolution. So the French Revolution also began quite naively, this idea that a change was possible, and it just the revolution kind of ate itself in the end with the guillotine, for example. So, is it possible to have this idealism? And is idealism also naivety? A question that gets asked a lot, and I'm coming towards the end of the video now, is the novel a feminist text? I think the follow-up question has to be, what do you mean by feminist? Because it's relatively easy to find that there are over 70 different types of feminism that exist, with sections and subsections and so on, all of which have slightly different views. So feminist, again, a bit like the word better or progressive, is a bit subjective. What does it actually mean? And when you ask somebody, are you a feminist? They often struggle to answer you because they're not sure what it means either. So perhaps room for more research there. But there were maybe some mistakes of second wave feminism in the 60s and early 70s. For example, there was the claim made at the time that you can't be an artist unless you are a lesbian. The movement could have also alienated a lot of women who would have been in favour of more practical things, such as getting a mortgage or credit card without a man's consent, by saying things like this. Some feminists at the time argued that sleeping with men was like sleeping with the enemy. And of course, that annoyed people, or women, who actually quite liked sleeping with men and found it fun. So that kind of sentiment alienated people as well. And just to bear in mind that unless women of reproductive age form allies, they will always be outvoted. So that means that women are going to be far more successful if they don't demonise men. And to show you what I mean by this, look at this pie chart. Women of reproductive age are always going to be in a minority, because men and women of non-reproductive age are higher in numbers. So unless women of reproductive age reach out and form alliances with men and women, they will often find themselves in the firing line. So it's interesting to think of society made up in this way. And that's, of course, what we see in The Handmaid's Tale. It's the reproductive women, or women of reproductive age, I should say, who are demonised, who are victimised, and who do arguably suffer the most. So that's interesting, just to think of society in that way. So the main aim of this video then was to give you just some interesting context of this novel, to this novel, things which I would want my students to talk about before or during their studying this, but to see this novel as not just a novel, but to see this novel as a representation of what society has been before and what society might be now. And that's why this novel remains powerful, because it has a relevance to it. And I always love talking about the word relevance with literature, because the reason why we study literature is because it tells us about who we are as people and about society more generally. That's where the power of literature comes from. So hopefully that was useful and you found it interesting. Thank you very much for watching, and good luck with your studies. Thank you.